Hello and welcome to From the Editor. I'm Mike Shearer, Executive Editor of the Columbus Dispatch. I'm here today with Sheridan Hendrix, our beat reporter for higher education, and we're here to talk today about the implementation of Senate Bill 1 and all the changes that are happening on Ohio's college campuses. But welcome. We're glad you're with us this week. Sheridan, I always ask you guys to introduce yourselves a bit first and explain to our reader or viewers what you are, your beat, and how you go about your job. So we'll start there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I cover higher education here for the Columbus Dispatch, which means that I cover all of the colleges and universities here in Central Ohio, Ohio State being the largest of them. So definitely takes up the majority of my time, but really looking at a variety of issues across college campuses, whether it's hyperlocal things happening on that specific campus, if it's trends happening across campuses with faculty, staff, students, or in the case of this story today, legislation that affects college campuses.
And really, there's more than legislation, of course, though. It's also the Trump administration and all their various executive orders and statements about, and letters to universities about what they can and can't do in certain areas, DEI mostly, obviously, and other similar areas. So really, as this school year began back in August, all the universities across Ohio were scrambling to deal with the Trump orders and Senate Bill 1, which passed last year. And let's talk about those separately maybe a little bit here first, but start with Senate Bill 1. Mm-hmm. What did that require Ohio State and other public universities in Ohio to do? And kind of walk through the facts of that first.
Yeah, so Senate Bill 1 officially went into effect in June of this year. Some folks might remember it as Senate Bill 83, which was a very similar law proposed in the last General Assembly. And what it basically is a bill that will vastly change how higher education looks and operates here in the state of Ohio. It is a wide-ranging bill. There are lots of things that were included in this. Faculty unions no longer are able to strike on college campuses. There were some provisions forbidding universities from having partnerships with Chinese universities. But what has probably gotten the most attention is provisions related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, specifically removing programming, offices, scholarships, really anything that would fall under the category of DEI. So that was reintroduced earlier this year in this current General Assembly as Senate Bill 83 did not make it through in the last one, was reintroduced earlier this year and really just sped through the Ohio State House, was passed in March, signed by Governor DeWine, and then officially went into effect over the summer.
Okay, so and then simultaneously, obviously, President Trump took office in January, and his Dear Colleague letter, as you write here, gave schools an ultimatum to either eliminate race-based decision-making from their campuses by that month or risk losing federal funding. So there's really been two major things that have been going on simultaneously, although the Ohio law really took care of a lot of what Trump was looking for in the first place.
Yeah, and it's important to note that specifically with the Dear Colleague letter, that's not law. Dear Colleague letters are just, guidance given from the Education Department. But given how swiftly some of the actions from the federal administration have been taking place, everything kind of happened, at least here in Ohio, just so fast and so, just so quickly that a lot of folks were really confused on exactly what facets were being on college campuses were being affected by which parties. So how much of this was Senate Bill 1? How much of this was the Trump administration? How much of this was just college presidents, making decisions on their own accord? So there was a lot of confusion earlier this spring and, spring semester that has continued so far into fall semester.
So when we set out to have you do the story, the question we were trying to answer is what's really changed on campus this fall? Obviously, there's been job eliminations, program eliminations, those types of things. But to the students who are attending Ohio State or elsewhere, what is tangibly different today than it was in spring semester last year? So that was what you set out to find out. And what have you learned in this reporting process?
Yeah, so for most students at Ohio universities, you're not going to see a ton of massive changes. You're not going to see, new buildings erected on campus, saying, DEI is horrible or something like that. You're not going to see necessarily buildings being torn down that were once home to maybe an LGBTQ center or a women's center, while many of those centers have since closed or rebranded in some way, shape, or form. At Ohio State, for instance, 2 of their DEI-related offices closed, at the end of spring semester, but they've, they're working to kind of rebrand one of those offices in a way that, in the words of the university, is inclusive to all students and, whether, regardless of your race, gender, ethnicity, any potential identifier. So there have been some changes in that sense, but like on the whole, what I'm hearing from people is like, you're not walking across campus and you're seeing, any folks out there like telling you, don't talk about DEI or don't talk about this or don't frame it in this way. What we're really seeing, according to the faculty and staff that I've talked to, is a chilling effect across campus. It is not so much here's the like physical embodiment of this bill, but it is more of here's kind of the feeling on campus. People are confused. People are concerned. There's some confusion still between what was in SB 83 and SB 1, and there was some changes in the law that we have today, but there's still just a lot of confusion there, which is causing people to really take a step back and say, I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want to do anything that could potentially cause us to lose federal funding, lose state funding, have some kind of government body, looking down on my campus or looking, investigating me for any action. So I'm just going to kind of play it cool. And from folks that I've talked to, like that is really causing some concerns on campus.
You have one quote here from Chris Orban, an Ohio State physics professor, says it's the Wild West of interpreting the bill, in terms of interpreting the bill, and other similar comments. And then we'll come back. The chalking issue at Ohio State, I'll come back to in a second, but that's also been viewed as, quote, an assault on free speech. But Senate Bill 1, let's talk about in the classroom here. I taught a couple years ago at Kent State for 2 semesters, and in those classes, we were talking about, for example, and this was while Senate Bill 83 was being debated, we would talk about how to get public records for training young journalists how to get public records. And I remember one time making a comment about how it's harder to get public records today than it was before a few years ago. And I went home that day wondering, I wonder if that would be construed as a violation of this law if it were in place, because I was critical of, just how hard it is to get public records today versus the past. So I think for professors, I can kind of understand where they're coming from in that concern. In Senate Bill 1, it says, you cannot endorse or oppose any controversial belief on political issues, climate policies, etc. So when you talk to professors, what are they telling you about this chilling effect? Is it just that no one wants to be in trouble, obviously, probably? Yeah,
it's that exactly. No one wants to be the target of an investigation. No one wants to be the one that gets their university or their department in trouble. There are certainly a couple of camps on this. There are professors who are like, I am going to continue to teach how I've taught for years. And this law is not going to scare me into, talking about, the history of slavery in America or, any potentially controversial topic as it comes up in my class because it's history or it's in this, in the literature that we're reading. So there are definitely some folks that are like, I'm going to continue to teach as I have taught for decades. There are certainly other camps of folks that are like questioning, as you have, is this considered a controversial topic? Yeah. I heard from, some students who had talked with their professors who were told, am I allowed to talk about recycling in the classroom? Is recycling a controversial topic? Do I need to, change how I'm talking about that in the classroom? Yeah. It's a real question. So the folks who are maybe erring on the side of, I don't know what I'm allowed to talk about, it is really because, as Chris Orban said, the Wild West of interpreting it. There have been a couple of faculty members who have shared with me that, across the board, whether you're faculty, staff, administrators, there's still just a lot of unknowns, and there's kind of this fear among many on college campuses across the state that, are there folks who are waiting to see what's going to happen? What's going to be the litmus test to figure out how severe the punishment could be for talking about recycling or talking about slavery? Who knows?
Public records or whatever.
Yeah.
So what happens? I mean, is there a process? Let's say you're in a class at Ohio State or any public university in Ohio, and you feel your professors cross this line. Can you file a complaint about it? How does that part of it work?
Yeah, so there are reporting mechanisms for this, and many of those have been in place since before SB 1.
Yeah, we've always been complaining about professors, obviously.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that is still there. Some of these schools have perhaps rebranded some of the language around that as, you can still be a whistleblower for, if you think that there's something going on in your classroom that maybe crosses a line or, makes you uncomfortable. I know that at Kent State, for instance, there was an email sent out to students specifically as an SB1 reporting, website.
Okay.
So it's been there before, but now there's language around it specifically saying if there's anything that happens in your classroom that, potentially crosses the line of SB1 to go ahead and report it. There's also a facet of SB1, which will go into effect later in the academic year, related to student evaluations of their professors. There are a couple of questions that are being mandated to be added to all evaluations of faculty members by their students. Specifically related to, are there controversial topics being discussed in the classroom? Are your professors trying to convince you or persuade you on these topics? That is not the correct, the exact language, but that's the essence of it. Is your professor creating an environment where, diversity of thought and diversity of speech is being, created? And that is also a fear among some faculty members. How is this going to be used to potentially impact us? If we have a couple of rogue students who are upset with us, how is this
had a couple of students who, on either political perspective, thought you were crossing the line, they could complain about it.
Exactly.
And what happens then is the big question.
Absolutely.
Okay. I mean, obviously, I think professors strive to be, like we do as journalists, we try to tell both sides of a story. When you're teaching an issue or a topic, I think you try to provide all perspectives. I mean, I think that's a reasonable expectation, I guess. But, okay. Well, it'll be really interesting what happens with that. So let's talk about the chalking at Ohio State, which you write about here is not related to Senate Bill 1 directly, but it is related to the bigger issue of allowing free expression on campus, but doing it within certain boundaries. Can you explain what happened at Ohio State there?
Yeah, so at the end of the summer, kind of right as the semester was getting started, Ohio State changed its university signage laws, its language around that, saying that chalking, so the practice of taking chalk and writing on, the sidewalks.
Campus tradition.
Exactly. Children have done it for, decades, on playgrounds and, also on college campuses. So that is no longer allowed at Ohio State. It is, banned across campus. Students are no longer allowed to write chalk on sidewalks. There were already some restrictions around, like, you're not allowed to write on buildings, on vertical spaces. You had to be able to write somewhere where, like, rain could, wash it away. But essentially, students are no longer allowed to use this form of expression on campus. The explanation from the university was that over the last year or so, so much of the chalking on campus was causing a great administrative stress because some of it was related to the Israel-Palestine conflict. There was some question about, is this allowed to be chalked? Are these words allowed to be chalked? There was a lot of question and consideration from the university on, can we clear this away when this chalk over here, potentially could also be problematic. So the university decided we're just going to go ahead and ban chalking outright. This has caused a lot of frustration among students, definitely faculty and staff too, who promote and support student speech. But there are a lot of students on campus who, use chalking to promote their sorority bake sale and undergraduate student government elections. So chalking was not just used as a form of free speech and protest, but also, it was used for plenty of reasons on campus. So I will say, as someone who goes to campus quite often for my job, chalking has not stopped on campus. It is certainly still there. I see plenty of chalk across the Oval and other sidewalks. Many of them have arrows pointing to them saying this is free speech or this is political speech. It has really caused some question of how much of this is actually a free speech issue versus an administrative issue.
So the next question will be, is if Ohio State chooses, and I'm not saying they will or won't, chooses to punish a student either internally or otherwise with violation of that policy, that's where your lawsuit or whatever could come out of that, right? That's the next step in these processes, is what happens when people don't comply with what is being prescribed in Senate Bill 1 or in Trump orders or on that chalk policy. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. And there's, to my knowledge, there have not been any lawsuits thus far related
Yeah.
to chalking. There have not been any, major fines given. There's like a reporting process for that. I think you have to catch someone in the act of chalking.
Yeah.
I don't know how many folks are like really vigilant as to, trying to stop people from chalking. But there's definitely a question of kind of what's going to be the litmus test and what's going to be the incident that causes a potential lawsuit on any of these counts.
Okay. So the answer to my original question of what's changed is a lot has changed. I mean, there's also been changes to websites and email addresses, and I think the land acknowledgement story you had last week about how they're no longer acknowledging that the land came from Native Americans. Although I had an email from another university professor last week, a different public university, and they did still have that, interestingly. So obviously compliance is a process. It takes time. But we don't really expect anything else major, I guess, really until there's a complaint about this, or the students aren't noticing much until something else happens. Is that?
So there are some deadlines associated with the bill. As I said earlier, there's so much packed into SB 1. So there are several more deadlines, like we were talking about earlier with the faculty evaluations. There's some deadlines with getting that in. There's a new American history and civics course that needs to be implemented on college campuses as part of this bill. That's going to go into effect next year. And as you just mentioned, there's a lot of, scraping of language from websites and making sure that everything is SB 1 compliant now. So it's kind of going to be a slow roll. One of my sources told me, college campuses are bureaucracies. These are massive institutions, especially a school like Ohio State, where there are so many campuses and so many offices and, 60,000 plus students. So it's going to take some time for this to really, fully become implemented across campus. But what we're seeing right now is a lot of confusion, a lot of questions of compliance. Just like, why is this happening at Ohio State but not at UC? Why is this happening at Youngstown but not at Ohio University? It's going to take some time for there to be some real, blanket compliance and figuring out what is exactly SB1 and what is not. But that's part of the question.
Well, it's human nature. If 100 people read the same bill, they're going to have 100 different interpretations, or at least 10 or 20 different interpretations.
Yeah.
So.
And when I talked to Jerry Serino, the bill sponsor, about this, I was asking specifically about some dorm decorations, which was another facet at Ohio State that they said, common spaces and dormitories can't be decorated in anything other than Ohio State spirit because we want to make a welcoming environment per SB1 for everyone. And when I asked Jerry Serino, are dorm decorations was this part of your vision? He said, no, it's certainly not in the bill, but I think there's a difference between the language of the law and the spirit of the law. Yeah. And he's putting a lot of trust into boards of trustees and university administrators to not only implement the letter of the law, but then also interpreting the spirit of the law. So I think that is also going to be a question of, how are different campuses going to create their own policies in the spirit of the law in addition to the letter of the law.
But in the end, it's how it's enforced, too.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, if a student goes and puts a DEI type message on their door as their personal space, and the university says you're kicked out or whatever, I mean, I'm not saying they're going to do that, but that's where the really big stories are probably to come here in the future, if that happens.
Yeah, and if students transfer from one public university to another, if someone at UC decides to come to Ohio State, they could be facing some potentially nuanced differences in the law, and that could also cause issues at some point. Okay. But it will be very much a wait and see.
So the end of the story basically is that you're very busy these days covering all these various things.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And I have some job security, I think, with everything going on in higher ed.
Yes, there's no doubt about that. We've been getting you a lot of help here recently, too. So, all right. Well, thank you, Sheridan, for joining me today to talk about your story. That'll be in Sunday Dispatch and online at dispatch.com. Appreciate all our viewers for joining us again this week, and we'll be back next time with From the Editor. Thank you all. Until then, I'm Mike Shearer. This is Sheridan Hendrix. Thank you.